Hi, it's Penny here, and as usual, I'm here to talk about some bookish things. Specifically, today I wanted to talk about the last 1,000 pages of epic fantasy that I read. I'll give you an overview of the books as well as an idea of what I did and didn't like about the books and whether I would recommend them to you. So in this case, 1,000 pages is only 2 books, and the first book was actually 998 pages, so it almost covered the whole 1,000 pages itself. But I will also throw in a second book. But let's firstly talk about this 998 page chunker. And the book that I'm talking about is The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. So The Way of Kings is the first book in the Stormlight archive, which is going to be a 10-book series. And no doubt all of these books are going to be just as massive as The Way of Kings. So it's a massive series and a massive commitment. So far, only the first 3 books have been released, but at least Brandon Sanderson is an author that we can trust to keep pumping the series out, unlike some other authors, who I won't mention right now. But while I try to be understanding when authors delay releases, shit happens, there are a few authors that I'm feeling less than charitable about at the moment. But let's not talk about that, because we're talking about The Way of Kings. So what is the story about? It's about a lot of things, hence the number of pages. So in the beginning, the story starts with these 10 warriors who are part of this losing battle. Each of them has a different magical sword, and they talk about how they don't want to have to go back, and so they're going to leave the battle and leave everybody to manage without them. It's very mysterious. It doesn't make a lot of sense. And after reading the whole book, where I thought it would be clarified to some amount, I still don't really know what's going on there. There are some hints about what's going on with that, so I hope at some point it's going to become clear. After that, we follow this assassin who kills the king of one of these 2 groups of people who've just formed a treaty, but this assassination completely ruins that treaty, and so most of the story is following the war between these 2 groups of people. So my absolute favorite thing about this book was its analysis of leadership, especially values-based leadership and servant leadership, which is perhaps something very specific to me because that is very related to my working life, but it's a very significant theme throughout the book. 2 of our main characters spent a lot of time thinking about how they should act in positions of leadership. Of course, this being a Brandon Sanderson novel, there is also an amazingly complex magic system, which I love, although I will say that at the moment, the different magic systems seem quite separate. I suspect that at the end, Brandon Sanderson is going to bring it all together into a holistic view. You can already see some hints of that, but it does mean that it's very difficult to get a handle on what's going on in the beginning, because we have these magic swords that give people extra strength. We also have soul casting, where people are able to change one element to another element. We've got this assassin who has binding skills, where he's able to flip around gravity for individual objects and uses that as part of his battling. We've also got these spren, which are these little magical creatures that all have different kinds of elements, I guess, or different aspects. So it's very interesting, but very complex. And correspondingly, it's a very complex world. Brandon Sanderson is big on his world building, but there is so much going on here that even after 1,000 pages, I still feel like I've really only learned a tiny piece of what's going on. Throughout the book, there are these little interludes from random individuals' perspectives, and while I expect that eventually the information you learn in these interludes will be useful, a lot of the time I just felt overwhelmed with the number of characters that I need to keep in my head. I also thought that a big focus of these books is Dalinar, who is this prince who is struggling with visions. He's also an older man. He has a magic sword. He has a lot of thoughts about leadership, which I really appreciated, but he spends a lot of time in war and having battles, and I felt like a lot of that was a waste of time. I didn't care. There's another character called Katherine. Again, he has a lot of thoughts about leadership, and he is a really interesting character, but there's a lot of battles and war that, again, I felt got a little bit tedious and became quite unnecessary. I would have liked a lot more focus on the women that are researching certain historical events. So one is this princess and another is this noblewoman trying to sort out some family issues. I thought they were much more interesting characters and that they didn't get nearly enough page time. And I really also would have liked some more time with the assassin. He was absolutely my favorite. I have to say, the very beginning of the book, you start with those epic warriors with their magic swords, and it's really epic, and then you get pulled down straight away into this assassin, and he's not quite as cool as the magic sword guys, but he does have these binding abilities, so he's still pretty cool. And then straight away again you get pulled down to this character who is just a lowly child pulled into war who has no idea what's going on. And it just felt like very quickly you started out really epic and then you were pulled down to like, what's the point of this? So it meant the very beginning of the story was quite disappointing, or at least that was my experience. So overall, I just think that the plot was very slow moving. There were a lot of really interesting themes investigated and the characters were really interesting, but I do think that it could have been much shorter than 998 pages and still got most of those points across. That said, if you like really complex magic systems and world building and you're okay with putting in thousands of pages of reading without getting much clarity, if you're happy to think about themes of leadership and war and focus on character building, then I definitely think you will like this book. Of course, if you like Brandon Sanderson, then you're probably going to want to read this book anyway. I would say that I don't think that this is a great place to start for Brandon Sanderson at all, because it's just going to take you way too long to get a real feel for what he can really do. So I gave this 4 stars, mainly because I really enjoyed it. I'm definitely looking forward to reading the next books in the series, but I just do not think it needed to be that long. So I probably talked about that for way too long. So how can I criticize Brandon Sanderson for going on too long when I do it myself? But anyway, let us talk about the second book, and that is The Bear and the Nightingale by Katherine Arden. So this is the second book in the Winternight series, so it does mean there are quite a few things I can't talk about without spoiling the first book, but the series is mainly about this girl named Vasya who lives in Russia. I'm not sure exactly what year, but historical Russia. Sometime in the past. This is at a time when the Catholic Church is spreading across Russia, and Vasya has the ability to see different Russian folklore creatures. Now, this Russian folklore is at odds with the Catholic religion, so Vasya is put in quite a difficult place between these two belief systems. And I really love the character of Vasya. I think she's really strong and interesting, and I find the Russian folklore creatures are just so different from mythological creatures that it's really interesting to read about. Unfortunately, the series doesn't have enough of those fantastical elements in my opinion. Even I think the first book had more of it than the second book. And in fact, the second book, we don't even see Vasya for like the first 50 pages of the book. Instead, we're following her brother and sister who are at the capital interacting with the king. It's very political and all about the traditions and norms in Russia at that time. So I think if the political stuff is something you're interested in, that probably won't be a problem for you. But for me, it was very frustrating. I just wanted to get into the magic and see where Vasya's journey was going to take her next. Also, for most of the story, Vasya is dressing as a boy and pretending to be a boy, and that's never really a trope that I find that interesting. Luckily, towards the end of the story, the fantastical elements and the folklore creatures become much more significant in the plot, and the pacing did improve, and I felt much more engaged in the story. So I did eventually give the story 3 stars, but there was a time when it was a risk at getting 2 stars from me. I will also say there is a romance throughout the first and the second book, and I didn't really feel like it felt very developed or realistic, and it was almost creepy. so that wasn't my favorite either. I do still want to read the third book in the series though, so once I've read that, I can give you an overview of the series and whether I recommend the series as a whole. That's all I have to talk about today. If you've read either of these books, I would love to talk more details with you down in the comments. Do you agree with what I had to say about them? Or otherwise, I'd love to know whether you are interested in picking those books up now based on my recommendations, or do you think you're going to avoid them now based on my recommendations? Either way, I would love to know. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you're having a wonderful day, and I will see you next time.